Now we're up to the head. Now there's a couple of things you need to check before you even get your head machined. If you're going to go in that direction, if you're going to replace the whole head, and that's a different story. But before you even start getting anything machined, what you want to do is you want to make sure that the head isn't warped. The way we do that is while the head's off the block, because when it's bolted down to the block, it might be sitting flat, but when we remove it off the block, take those head bolts out, there might be a warp there. So what we're going to do is we run a straight edge where the cams sit. And the idea is you don't want to have any feeling of the straight edge rocking. So you're testing the middle one if it's rocking or if it's out of whack, like that, like so. The end one's a little bit difficult to test because you can't stick your straight edge through there anywhere, and you're only testing on 2. So you've got to either test 3 at a time to make sure they're not rocking, or the whole length, and you want to just make sure there's no little gap under there, and this one actually looks okay. So what happens if that head was warped and they didn't straighten the head out? If you can imagine the head, say when you take it off the head it's warped like that, then they machine it. If it's bowed like that, they're going to machine just the ends of it. What happens is if it's warped like that, this side where the cam runners are running will be high. When you bolt it all down, if you can imagine the head, that's exaggerated, but if it's like this, these are going to be low and these are going to be high, so the cam's actually going to be not free to spin in there. So you'll end up wearing out the cam runners prematurely. The same goes if it's dipped like this and they machine it, they'll end up machining the middle part of the head. It'll look nice and beautiful and straight, but this is the end that's important as well, where the cam runners are running. So like I said, you need to just confirm that it's all nice and straight, doesn't need to be straightened before they machine it. So we've had this one machined, and they took off the minimum, they basically just touched it. You can also confirm that by measuring the thickness at a few spots. The thickness of the head, you need to get a micrometer and just take a few reference points. When it comes back, you can remeasure it and just make sure that they have actually done what they said, or how much they have taken off, if you think that they've taken too much off. On these particular motors, you can get head gaskets that are different thicknesses. Something to look out for. Now another thing that wears out on these are these little jiggers in here, and that's where the valve runs through that little sleeve. It's called a valve guide. You want to just make sure that they're not too worn and that the valves aren't getting stuck in there or binding up. They can either get stuck because those valve guides are contaminated, carboned up, or bent. So one way that you can test to see if that's running true, that it's straight, is either in a lathe. You just put it there and spin it, and soon enough you'll see that moving around like that. If you don't have a lathe, you can also put it in your bench drill. Put it in there and you'll also see that whether it's bent or not. We're going to do, because this motor hasn't actually done a lot of kilometres, so what we're going to do to start with, get a texter like I've already done. We just mark with a texter where the valve seats. The same on here. And the idea of this is to show you, for for starters, how much is in contact with there, both on the head and on the valve, and whether you need to machine it or lap those valves in. So we'll just go ahead and do that. We'll put that in there. We'll get our little lapping tool with a suction cup. Sometimes if you put a little bit of solvent on there, it'll stick a little bit better. I'll try that bigger one. And you're just starting to see where it's in contact there. You can see that shiny a bit. Same as on the head there. As for reference, there are the angles that you should machine your valves to, or grind them to. You can see that the intake and the exhaust have slightly different angles. And here's another, just a standard generalized measurement of how wide the seats are supposed to be. You can see that the standard should be 1.25 to 1.55 width, and the maximum that you can't go over would be 2 mil or 80 thou. So I've had the young bloke doing the old school fire starter lapping in, and I'm showing him the high-tech old school way that we used to do it. We used to just put some little rubber tubes on the valves, glue them with some super glue or araldite or something like that, and we've got a suitable sized shank that goes into those tubes, and we're just going to lap it in low speed with the grinding compound, the fine stuff, because this one doesn't need a lot, it just needs a clean up. So you don't need high-tech gear to do these valves. You don't need to bust your wrists trying to start a fire with them either, with the manual one. You can do it that way. So there we go. Now we can just put a little bit of grinding paste on there. Grab our drill, low speed, and it's come off, the glue's come off. So we'll just mix up some glue so we can glue these tubes, little rubber tubes on the end of the valves, so we can lap them in. A little bit of paste, grinding paste on there. Careful not to get it on the valve stem. Low speed, don't stick that into It's looking good. May also pay to put a little bit of oil on there just so you don't wear out that valve stem. They are hardened steel, but good idea to put a little bit on there. We're going to go through and do the rest of them by hand. If those seats wear out too much, you can machine the head and drop a new seat in there and then machine it all. But most often people just buy a whole new head on these. Now that we've lapped them in, checked all the seats are all okay. I haven't washed the valves yet, but it's important to clean all that grinding paste or any muck that's in there even after the head's been machined really well. So you'll find if you sort of move your head around and blow through those ports, the angle of the air and the pressure of the air will actually blow out extra bits and pieces. I've just blown off a few of these ports and you'll see tiny little shards of alloy coming out of there, probably when they machined the head. So it's important to have it all as clean as you can. Now, just to recap, we've lapped in the valves. We didn't think that the valve stems were worn enough to warrant changing any valves. The valve stem guides are all okay. We've tested all them. We've lapped in all the inlet and the exhaust. Cleaned it all up. We've had, I think they took off 2.5 thou off the actual head and 2.5 thou off the block. Before we even took it, we tested that the head wasn't warped or out of whack. And the way we did that was, if you remember, we checked where the cam journals sit. You don't want to have any sort of rocking there on that. They are difficult to straighten if you need to, but it can be done. The valves, again, we've lapped it in. We've made sure that the mating surface is within specs. It's got to be under 2 mil width. And we've gone through and cleaned everything thoroughly, blown it all out. There were little bits of shavings from when they machined the head flying out as well. So it's always a good idea to clean it and blow it out. Another thing, when you're cleaning these things, if you just blow air out, quite often the shavings will get stuck because they're dry. So you do actually need to have some sort of solvent or liquid to help carry that muck out when the air's blasting it out. And now we're ready to put it in, put it all back together. So we're going to just put all the respective valves back in their respective spots. Got all the valves in there, clean piece of cardboard, and we're just going to tip it over onto a flat surface. Valve stem seals, that's what they look like, and there's a little rubber bit inside that seals it off on that little valve guide, and on the outside there's a little lip seal that seals on the valve stem, and they'll have a little spring in there to just create a tension on that. So to knock these in, you need to have a tool that doesn't damage them. They are fairly hard to push down, especially if you're doing set of valve stem seals in the vehicle. We've got this tool we've made, and you can see we've got a provision there for the valve. These valves are 5 mil stem, so that stem, or that hole right in the middle, needs to be more than 5 mil, and then also this outer bit needs to be a little bit more than the outer diameter of the valve stem. And of course you need to have that little step there just so I can push it in without damaging that top bit there where the rubber is. So you can see that we've got that in there. And that just goes on there like that. Little bit of oil. I'll do it over here on this one where you can see it. And you just basically put it on. You don't just force it down because you've got the sharp edge on the top of that valve stem. So you just sort of work it on like so. It'll go down, there you go. And then you've got that second bit where the collet sits in. And that's gone over. I've gone right down, and then we just tap it gently and you'll hear there's a different sound when it hits the bottom. And that's it. It's in. Another one. Bit of oil. We'll do this one here. Put it on there. Just sort of get it over that top sharp edge. There we go. Go on down, and we just tap it down. You can push those on without the valves in as well, but just bear in mind when you're pushing the valve in, don't just force it through. Again, it's going to have that sharp edge. I like to do it like that because that middle hole actually sort of guides it along the valve stem. And also, if you're doing it in the car or in the vehicle, changing a set of valve stems, the valves are going to be in there anyway like that. This side's all done, we'll just do the same on the other side. When I do 4D56U cylinder heads, I don't mind having a sip of Somersby Pear Sparkling Cider. My young bloke got me a slab. Not too shabby. Quite refreshing. So we've had our cider, and now we've got to rummage through this little container of goodies for these washers. And they sit on the bottom there. They just sit down there at the bottom of the spring, so the spring doesn't chew into your the alloy of your head. So you got to make sure you put every single one in, and they've probably made them dark in colour so you can actually see them a little bit better than that silver colour. You've got them all in place. You want to double check all of them and make sure that they've seated properly to the bottom there, and there's no muck caught underneath between the head and the springs. Now they're all, if you have a look, they're all the same height, so that tells me that they haven't actually compressed at all. If they were all odd sizes, then that would mean that some have collapsed. You might think about replacing the springs. And all the springs are the same. So put all the springs in. Remember to double check your work as you go, just make sure you haven't forgotten anything. That's what I like to do. Okay, all the springs are in. Now we've got the top part. The part that actually holds the little collets in place. So we put all them in, and the last two. All the little collets, hopefully you haven't lost any. And you'll notice that those collets, they're actually tapered. You'll see it's thicker at the top and narrower at the bottom. So you want this part at the top, and there's also a little groove there that falls into that top of that valve, and that actually holds the spring down, or holds the spring up against the valve. So don't put them in backwards or upside down. Now there are two ways you can well, probably more than two, but to reinstall these little collets back on there, either with the tool that we removed them with, which is the valve collet remover tool, or the valve compressor. Or you can do it another way. Remember the taper on that little collet, you have them facing down. You make sure they're nice and clean and dry, facing down. We just pop them in there like that. And you get something that's wider than that middle hole on those little collet retainer washers, or whatever you want to call them. This one's a 16mm long socket. I've got the little bar there, and basically what I do, I don't know if you'll see it here, I just put weight on it, just give it a bit of a wiggle, just slowly take it off, because sometimes the collets don't fall into place, and there we go, it's in. There's two of them in there. We'll give it a love tap in a moment just to make sure that they've seated properly, but that's an easier and quicker way of doing it. It is quite fiddly with a valve compressor. Taper sort of facing down, just plonk that in there like so, you can see that. And then our tool. Probably a good idea to wear goggles when you're doing this. And you just sort of pulse it down a little bit, and then see, it hasn't gone in all the way, it's sticking out, so that could fly out. That's why you wear goggles. Give it a couple of more compressions, and there you go. It's in. Now, one thing I did forget to mention, you'll find sometimes, like this one here, you'll see that the valve is in the middle of that retainer, so you just rotate the spring around a little bit until it sits in the middle. It'll just allow the collets to fall in either side of that valve stem easier. See, if it's like that, it'll be on to the side, and then it'll actually push the collet out when you put your weight on it. So you just find the best spot so it's in the middle there. And I've put all these in on this side. When you're pushing it on, you just sort of rotate that around like that, spiral it just as you're pushing down, leaning on it, just so it gives that collet an opportunity to fall in that little groove where it should be. That one's in. That one doesn't look like it's quite in. There we go. Now see that one, the collet's fallen out. You've got to be careful. See how it's fallen out? You've got to be careful when that happens. So that little guide wasn't probably right in the middle of that stem, and that's what happens. The valve actually pushes one of the collets out, so just be aware of that. It can get dangerous. Like I said, wear goggles. So it's only hanging on by one collet. So I'll take it out, and then you've just got to give it a bit of a wiggle until it releases, and then you've got to start again. There we go. Oh. There we go, it's out. Bit of mucking around, but come out. And you can see why, because if you look down there, down the bore, the valve wasn't sitting in the middle. So you've got to rotate it around till it gets as close to the middle as it can. Yeah, like that. Taper down. The other one. Give it another crack. There we go. It's in. So we'll just go through and do the rest of them. So I've got them all in. And now with all this sort of stuff with circlips, collets, things that are holding things under tension, you want to always just test that they've seated properly. The way we're going to do it is just with a brass drift there, and I'm just going to tap on the spring there. Now I've also got cardboard under the head so I don't damage the head or the valves or anything like that. And they all look like they've seated nicely. As well as doing a visual inspection, it's good to do something like this. All good. Now the next stage is to clean all the little ports on these rocker pivots. That's where the rocker sort of pivots off. And you want to make sure that those little holes in there are all clean. Sometimes they carbon up in there. Like your last one. Now you want to inspect that there aren't any burrs or anything like that in there. If there are, then you're wiser to replace them. Like anything that's unserviceable or unusable, good idea to replace. It's a much easier job to replace it now than after you put it in and find out it's no good. And they all just go in here. They should all be the same.